Hello. During the first half of the 20th century, British pump manufacturers made a variety of different types of pumps for various uses. In this video, I'll be talking about what I consider to be some of the most interesting, rare and collectible of these pumps. Some of the pumps are rare because very few were made. For instance, they were prototypes or they didn't sell well and were replaced by other models. Others are interesting and collectible because of a particular technical feature which sets them apart from the crowd or illustrates a notable innovation. Some are mainly of interest because they were made for a unique purpose, for example for military use in World War II or for weight saving in performance cars. Finally, I've included some pumps which are there simply because of their beauty of their appearance and their design. Very attractive in appearance, which illustrates the pump maker's art. So without further ado, let's get on to discussing some of these rare, interesting and collectible pumps. If any of you are pump collectors or wish to become one, don't hesitate to get your hands on one of these if it becomes available and if your budget covers it. Hello, the first pump I wanted to talk about was the Nest-Hill Major. Nest-Hill, or the Ernest Hill Company, were one of the first pump manufacturers to come into existence. They made hand stirrup pumps initially, but then moved on to foot pumps. And the Nest-Hill Major is their largest foot pump, but it's very rarely seen these days, and I can only think very few were made, and it's therefore very rare. Just having a quick look at the pump, it's a simple single stage pump with a piston moving up in a barrel when the downstroke takes place. The piston head has a non-return valve in the middle of it, which allows air to pass from the compression chamber into this hollow piston rod and then out through a rubber tube to the tyre. The most important points about the Nest-Hill Major are as follows. First, it has a circular pressure dial gauge situated here just under the barrel, which allows the pressure to be shown during pumping. It's a board-on tube gauge which uses an internal board-on tube to move the dial. The gauge is situated just under the barrel for protective purposes so that it doesn't get damaged so easily, which however does make it more difficult to read. But having a gauge like this is very unusual in a vintage pump. Only one or two makers and then only one or two models use this, mainly because it's very delicate and easy to damage. That's why it was placed here in this case below the barrel to give it some protection. The second interesting and innovative technical feature with the Nest-Hill Major is this one-way non-return valve at the front of the barrel. This on the upstroke allows air to pass directly from atmosphere into the barrel in front of the piston to charge the barrel before the next downstroke. On the downstroke, this one-way valve closes such that air is compressed and forced out along the tube at the back. This is a unique feature and I've not seen this in any other foot pump, and what is its effect is that it makes pumping very, very smooth with no resistance to air getting into the chamber during the upstroke. So that's the Nest-Hill Major, a very rare and sought after pump, the largest of Nest-Hill's foot pumps, and very collectible if you can find one to buy. This is an example of the Kismet 85 foot pump. You can see it here alongside similar pumps like the Kismet Baby and the Kismet Popular, and in fact the Kismet 85 is just a bigger version of these two pumps. So it has the name Kismet 85 on the foot pedal, and also on a nice maker's nameplate on the side. Now this is quite an unremarkable foot pump in technical terms, because it's as with the Baby and the Popular, it's a simple single stage pump with a coil spring at the front, a single piston in a barrel, and exiting via a non-return valve at the base of the pump. So no technical interest whatsoever compared with other pumps. But what sets it apart is that it's very rare. I've only seen 1 or 2 examples of this pump in my 15 years or 20 years of involvement with vintage foot pumps, and I can only think it's rare because very few were made. We don't know the reason for the name, whether 85 can't refer to a year, because Kismet were not in business in 1885 and weren't in business in 1995. So I've no idea why the name was chosen. I've asked several friends and colleagues in the business if they have any ideas, and we've not come up with any decent explanation. So there we have it, the Kismet 85, a mystery pump. We don't know why it was named this, and we don't know how many were made, but very few. But if you're a serious Kismet pumps collector, this is one you should really strive to get into your collection if you see one available. Here we have a beautiful pump, a Walters & Dobson military issue 2-stage pump. The Walters & Dobson logo is on the foot pedal, and if we zoom in closely we can see the military issue store mark on the protective plate with the broad arrow signifying that it's Crown property. The pump is interesting because Walters & Dobson were one of the very few makers apart from the Kismet company that made 2-stage pumps, and this one is as I say, a military issue one, which is distinguished by the protective cover plate which is in place to protect the barrel from rough military use. The principle is very similar to the Kismet 2-stage pumps, where compression takes place initially in the outer barrel and then a secondary piston compresses in the inner barrel before it's delivered from the aperture at the front. Here we also have a pressure test valve which allows pressure to be taken without disconnecting. The point of technical interest about the pump is that the 2-stage principle used inside it is very much simpler than the Kismet one and has fewer moving parts. The pressure, the air is transferred through a thin inner barrel via holes in that barrel rather than through the hole in the secondary piston as in the Kismet Duplex Master. But there you have it, a beautiful military issue Walters & Dobson foot pump, which is really quite rare and very interesting to have in the collection alongside a 2-stage Kismet Duplex foot pump. The final point to note about it is that, as with many military issue pumps, it has holes in the base, back at the back and at the front, to allow it to be attached to a stabilising board during use. That's another feature of military issue pumps. This one is fitted with the Kismet's Renroot connector, the very best connector that was made. There you have it, Walters & Dobson 2-stage military issue pump, very collectible. Here we have a very interesting pump from the SM Stuart Turner Company of London. It has a military issue mark, the broad arrow at the top, and if we draw back you'll see that this pump is very similar to the Kismet Duplex Master, which is just behind it, and therein lies the interest. This pump by Stuart Turner is a direct clone of the Kismet Duplex Master, and it was produced in World War II when the government were trying to expand the production of pumps to support the war effort and increase the manufacturing base. So in fact what happened is that the patents were suspended and other companies were invited to make pumps to the same specification as the Kismet Duplex Master. So here we have the Stuart Turner pump, which, if you look at it closely, is identical in all respects to the Kismet Duplex Master, except that there is actually no name on the foot pedal and it's fairly plain, but it has got the military holes in the bottom for screwing to a stabilising base if needed. So this pump is interesting. It's quite rare, but it's a direct clone of the Kismet Duplex Master, and when you get inside it, every detail is almost identical. So it's clearly the same pump that's just been produced by a different maker as a contribution to the war effort. So if you're a collector of Kismet pumps, it's interesting to have a copy of or an example of the Stuart Turner clone of the Kismet Duplex, which is of equally high quality, equally useful and equally collectible. The next pump I'll be talking about is the Kismet Multi. We see an example of it here with Kismet Multi on the foot pedal, and we look along it and we see it's a large barrel with a coiled spring at the front, and opening it up, there's what she looks like. Solid pump about 16 inches long with cross frames at the bottom, and behind it is an example of the Kismet Duplex Master, and that's there for a reason, because the Kismet Multi that we see here was actually a forerunner and the prototype of the Kismet Duplex Master, and it's extremely rare. I've only seen one or two examples of it around, and because of its role in the development of the Kismet Duplex Master, it's extremely interesting from a technical viewpoint. So what we have in the Multi is a similar situation to the Master, where the first level of compression takes place in the large barrel. The second stage of compression takes place in the hollow piston rod here with a small piston inside it, and air is expelled on the downstroke at the front through a one-way non-return valve which is housed in the exit of the pump and onto the tyre. So there you have the Multi, and the only difference really in technical terms between the Multi and the Kismet Duplex is that in the Kismet Duplex the air is not expelled at the front, but is then passed through the stage 2 piston head into a narrow piston rod which takes the air out at the back of the Kismet Duplex Master. So what we assume is that one day an engineer had the idea, after designing and building the Multi, to take the air back through the narrow piston rod and put it out at the back rather than at the front. And most probably the reason for this is that the Multi, when used, in fact the air outlet here moves quite a lot, and depending on the length of the hose will put a strain on the tyre valve, and for that reason it's likely that the Kismet Duplex Master, where the air outlet is static, proved a more practical proposition for daily use. But the Multi was the pump which proved the principle of the Kismet Duplex Master and is very collectible. If you can find one, don't hesitate to get it into your collection, because it's an iconic pump with very few around. Here we have an interesting special purpose pump. This is the lightweight Kismet Popular. It's a special purpose pump because it was built in this lightweight version for particular applications, for example, saving weight in high performance sports cars, and it was indeed supplied in some Alfa Romeos, some other high-end sports cars like Aston Martin as well. The idea is simply that the standard Kismet Popular, and we see a normal steel framed one here, is simply replaced by the aluminium frame, and that's no more to it than that. The rest of the pump is exactly the same design with no differences in performance. The only difference is that this lightweight Kismet Popular weighs in at about 2 kilograms, and the steel framed one is just over 3 kilograms. So in applications where the saving of 1 kilogram was important in weight, this pump was utilised. We mentioned in an earlier clip that the subject of cloning of pumps, that's copying of pumps by one company for another, was carried out in the Second World War to increase the manufacturing base and to support the war effort. But the idea of cloning of pumps also went on for purely commercial reasons. So large manufacturers would make replica copies of their pumps, but branded them differently for smaller companies to sell under their own branding. So here we have a good example. Here we have the Romac heavy duty pump. This is a solid 16-inch long pump, a single stage, with the air being compressed in the large barrel and exited at the front. The large hollow piston rod acting as a reservoir in this case to allow continuous delivery during pumping. But what we notice here is there's another pump next to it called the PCL Emperor. This is the PCL Pneumatic Components Limited of Sheffield, and these were one of the really main large manufacturers of pumps. And the Romac company organised with PCL to produce PCL Emperors for them to sell, but simply rebrand them by putting a different name on the foot pedal. In all other respects, the pumps are identical and of equal quality because they were made by PCL, but the Romac was sold at a lower price point by Romac to expand their business and just to utilise the services of a larger manufacturer. Now, many companies went in for this cloning. PCL was one, Dunlop, Kismet themselves, and several others did this cloning business just for purely commercial reasons. So if you do get a Romac heavy duty, look for a PCL Emperor to go with it, and you'll have a matching pair just with different names on them. The pump I'll be talking about next is the Kismet Duplex Junior, which you see here. Now, the duplex principle was used by Kismet in a whole variety of their pumps, very different sizes. So when we look at them on this picture here, the monster pump at the back, the Kismet Duplex Garage, is based on the duplex principle. The standard Kismet Duplex Master in the middle, based on the same principle, as was its forerunner, the standard duplex. But at some point during their production, Kismet decided to make this smaller version, the Junior Duplex. Now, this mustn't be confused with the normal Kismet Junior, which is a single stage pump. This is a genuine two-stage pump with compression taking place in the large barrel and in the small barrel at the front, but it has a few differences compared with the larger pumps. The closing mechanism is different. It's a small lever underneath the foot pedal, and the frame is a different shape, different design. But broadly speaking, this pump is of the same design technically as the other larger duplex-based pumps. It's quite rare, and I don't know really why it's rare. Maybe they decided that going to the smaller scale of duplex wasn't commercially viable and people preferred the more easily maintained single stage pumps. But nevertheless, this is a very collectible pump to get on your shelf if you want one, and very, very powerful. It packs a bigger punch than the normal Junior, Kismet Junior of the same size. A little bit trickier to overhaul, to take apart. It's not as easy as the bigger duplexes, but nevertheless a good pump to have. We mentioned earlier about the Nest Hill company, Ernest Hill of Sheffield, being one of the very earliest pump manufacturers. In fact, they worked with John Dunlop in Ireland when he produced his first pneumatic tyre. What we have here is a Nest Hill Venus. Now this is a small, lightweight Nest Hill pump, which has some interesting characteristics, like some splayed supports at the back for keeping it stable when pumping, and a very thin, lightweight design, long and thin, easily stored in compact spaces in the boot of a car or in a storage space. Now Nest Hill produced an upmarket version of this Nest Hill Venus called the Nest Hill Compact, which was supplied in many high-end cars like Rolls-Royces and Bentleys of the time. But this Nest Hill Venus was a small down-market version of it, supplied for what you might call your average motorist. So the adverts of the time indicated that it would be suitable for Morris and Austin 7 owners, etc. And indeed it is. If you just look at the size and the scale of it, this is only about 12 inches long, and would, when folded up, sits beautifully in a small space, and it's almost a direct replica of the larger Compact, but made to a slightly lower manufacturing standard, smaller, thinner frame, slightly smaller, etc. But a very, very useful and reliable little pump if you can get hold of it, the Nest Hill Venus. And if one were wanting to put together a collection of Nest Hill pumps representing the very earliest car tyre foot pump maker in the country, the Nest Hill Venus would be one that you'd want in your collection, similar to the Nest Hill Compact that we spoke, the Nest Hill Major, which we spoke about earlier in this video. Here we're looking at the Kismet Baby pump. Now, Kismet made many models of pump, and because they were in business for such a long time, several of the models had very long production runs, and during those production runs various tweaks and changes were made, so that at the end of a production run, a Baby, for example, was quite different in some ways to the earlier versions. So here we have two Kismet Baby pumps. This one here is a very early version from the 1920-25 period, and it's distinguished by having the Kismet Baby and the maker's information engraved on the brass barrel. It's also distinguished by having a conical return spring, that's one with a diameter larger at the back than at the front, and a wire closing mechanism which links into the foot pedal to close it in the closed position. So this very early Kismet Baby, probably over 100 years old as we speak, is rather different to the later version, which this one dates probably from the 40s or maybe early 50s, where you have a different sort of spring, a parallel spring. You have a closing catch which engages at the front, not at the back, and a rather heavier duty frame than the earlier Baby. So these represent the two extremes of the Kismet Baby range, and the old one here from the 1925 period is very collectible, quite rare, and good to have on your shelves if you want a cross-section of all the Baby models that were made during the period. One of the most popular models of pump made by the Kismet company was the Kismet Lorry. This is a heavy-duty pump aimed, as its name suggests, at heavy-duty applications on lorries or large tyres. What's not often appreciated, though, is that they made two versions of the lorry, the Mark 1 on the left here and the later Mark 2. Now these are different pumps in a sense, but they've decided to call them lorry for whatever reason, and both are called lorry. The one on the left, the lorry Mark 1, is a standard single stage pump with a hollow piston rod where air is compressed and fed into this large hollow piston rod, which acts as a reservoir during pumping. But this later lorry was produced for military use in World War II, and it's an entirely different pump with a narrower piston rod, same size barrel more or less, but a single piston, a single stage pump with an air exit at the back, whereas with the Mark 1 lorry the air exit is at the front. So this Mark 2 lorry is a very much heavier duty version than the original Mark 1 lorry, produced for military use and hard work involved in military applications during World War II. So a very heavy duty Kismet lorry Mark II, which is broadly equivalent to Kismet's other pumps, the Kismet Junior and the Kismet Popular. But this is a very rare pump, not easily obtained, and a good illustration of pumps that were made for heavy duty use in the war. This is a pump made by the Prima Company of Birmingham, and they don't give it a name. It's simply called a Prima pump, but it falls into what I would call my weird or what class. When we look at it and try and work out how it works, it's seen to have a very complicated lever mechanism for depressing the piston, but essentially it's a single stage pump with some small springs at the back to give it a return. And what's more intriguing, there's a tiny cylindrical pressure test apparatus at the front which incorporates a one-way non-return valve, and air is exited at the bottom of the pump. Now, several pumps were made over the years looking like this. I mean, we have the more classic example of the Woodmilne British Goodrich pump, which has all its mechanism and its springs and its levers beautifully on show, and has a decent board-on gauge pressure gauge at the front. But this Prima pump takes things to a whole new level. I think the designer must have worked out a way of trying to make the most complicated lever mechanism he could think of for producing movement in this pump, and also for some reason put a pressure test apparatus at the front, which is very difficult to read. The little indicator pops out under pressure, but the letters are too small to read and to gauge pressure. So this is my candidate for one of the most weird and wonderful pumps I've ever seen, and one of the least useful in my view. But if you wanted to have something weird and wonderful on your shelves, keep an eye open for this Prima pump. The majority of the pumps made in the vintage period were designed to carry in the boot of a car and were typically 12 inches, 14 inches or 16 inches long. But some of the makers went a step further and produced what I would call monster pumps. These are larger versions of their standard pumps, designed really for static garage use, where you didn't want to keep them in the car, but you kept them in the garage and took them up to the car to actually do the pumping. This one here is one of the most rare and collectible, a British Goodrich, British Tyre and Rubber Company pump based on the Woodmilne patent. So interesting pump with a large barrel, huge foot pedal, and pressure test valve at the front, and looking at the tape measure you can see that this is around the 20 inches long mark. Quite a substantial beast and a very rare monster pump. Other makers went in for monster pumps as well. Just as an illustration, the Kismet Duplex Garage Mark 1 is more or less the same size, and also the Sutty company went in for a large Sutty pump, again based largely on their smaller models, but just everything scaled up. Dunlop also produced the Dunlop Giant, and Kismet produced a Kismet Garage Mark II, which is actually identical to the Dunlop Giant. So there you have it, monster pumps. If you want a very efficient pump in the garage, but probably not wanting to put it in the boot of a car, this is the sort of thing to look for. The final pump I'd like to talk about is this lovely Hattersley & Davidson triple-barrelled, three-stage, so-called multi-stage foot pump. It compresses air in 3 stages, in 3 barrels, as you see, and it's generally considered by most people to be the most beautiful and visually attractive pump ever made. You see here a lovely maker's nameplate embossed on the barrel, with 3 barrels with a cup washer inside in each barrel. This has a pressure test valve at the back and some coiled torsion springs at the front. A very substantial frame and foot pedal, as you would need to pump at the same time into 3 barrels. The pump is very rare, and one can only assume that there's a reason for it being rare, and my theory is that it's quite a high maintenance pump, and when people discovered the need for continued maintenance during service, it became at least less popular. One of the main problem areas is these 2 gland boxes which the stage 2 and stage 3 piston rods pass through. These must be thoroughly packed, and indeed the packing, if not done well, allows leakage out and loss of efficiency, and there's a continual need during use to keep those tightened down, monitored and repack them if necessary. So something of a high maintenance pump, despite its beauty and attractiveness, which could have been the reason for it being relatively less popular and not so widely sold. The patent for the pump also covers the stirrup pump equivalents. So Hattersley & Davidson produced a inline triple-barreled stirrup pump, which we see here, and they also produced a clustered barrel, 3-barrel one, equivalent to that. So it's the same patent covering all different foot and stirrup pumps that Hattersley & Davidson made. So there you have it, what most people think of as the most beautiful and visually attractive foot pump ever made, and an extremely good example of the pump maker's art.